We want to learn how RFID technology is transforming retail, helping businesses shift from chaos to control. Join us on December 4th for From Chaos to Control, a LinkedIn live event by NEDAP ID Cloud featuring RFID experts like Caleb Campbell, Steffi Broer, and me, Paula Macaggi. You can register for it today. The link is in the show notes, and I hope to see you there. Many luxury brands are appointing China's slower economy as the reason for their not so optimistic last results compared to previous years. This can be partially true if you consider some of the aspirational customers, but there are some other layers that we need to dive into to really understand what is happening.
And at the end of the day, whether you're talking about prestige or luxury brands, one of the things that makes all these companies unique is that they have one way of doing things globally, and they're extremely consistent in the way they implement. And that's true everywhere, except when it comes to the Chinese digital ecosystem.
As you probably know, I was just in Shanghai last week to explore the market and understand more about their consumers, their economy, and opportunities. In this episode, we will discuss the luxury market and where it is headed in China. Here's Paula Macaggi, and this is episode 44 of my show. Welcome to OFFBounds. China has a population of over 1.4 billion people, and despite being the second largest global economy, it is the biggest contributor to the world growth with 38.9%. While the US contributes with 23% and India 9.3% according to MasterCard data. During my 1 week in China, I took 3 days to walk around the streets and malls to investigate if I could see some significant differences compared to big Western cities like New York, Los Angeles, Paris, or London. And between many differences that will be worth to comment on future episodes, I really noticed they have so many luxury stores. I've been many times to the Fifth Avenue in New York or to Champs-Élysées in Paris, and it was in Shanghai that I got most impressed. First, by the number of stores, and second, by how big they are. I even got confused and thought I had found their main shopping street, like, oh, this is the Champs-Élysées of Shanghai. But every other street I walked into felt like their main street. By many of the conversations I've had while in China, I learned that brands really need to wow customers to attract them to stores. And in such a competitive market, they need to stay relevant and impressive. To better understand the market in China, I talked to Jacques Roizen, who has been living in Shanghai for 12 years. Him and I met in his office during the beginning of a typhoon, and I was so mind blown by his perspectives that I invited him to share them with us. He was the CEO of a fast fashion brand called Etam China, the country CEO of Pandora, the CEO of an e-commerce operator called Baozun, and today he's the managing director of a consulting business called Digital Luxury Group.
I think the biggest difference when you look at the consumers in China is their appetite for newness. You're talking about, I like to compare it to a buffet. If you think about your grandmother and my grandmother, okay, when they were born, there was no such thing as a brand, okay. And today, you and I can take our phone and order online from any brand we want. And this journey has taken place over 3 generations. In China, it took place over 1 generation. It's in the 90s, really, that brands arrived and the concept of brands arrived in China, especially international brands were nowhere near before 1992. And so the Chinese consumer has been essentially consuming this buffet of innovation and brands and concept and so on in 1 generation. So they have a much bigger appetite and ability to consume a newness, right? And there's this obsession with being in the now, not being in the yesterdays. And so having today's brands or tomorrow's brands, but not yesterday's brands. And so that implies, an appetite for new brands, for new products, for new concepts, for new ways of purchasing. And so the speed at which the market moves towards new things is quite impressive, and I think very different from what I had seen, when I spent 16 years in the US before that, or in Europe, where I was born.
It is quite impressive and also quite challenging because brands can easily become old very quickly. So this appetite for newness is a big driver for brand innovation, and that's why we see and hear so much about retail in China. And that is far from being the main challenge. As we learned 2 episodes ago when I talked to Sharon Guy, the country's digital ecosystem is very unique. While in the West, a consumer that has the first intent to buy something starts the shopping journey by searching on Google or going to the brand's website, in China, the consumer starts by searching on Tmall or other platforms.
So having a successful e-commerce strategy in China implies that you have a very good understanding of how to operate on e-commerce platforms. And this is a very tricky thing because this is to a large extent, a new ecosystem. It didn't exist 20 years ago. On top of it, brands, outside of luxury brands, all mass brands, all, premium brands have entered Tmall and more recently JD, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12 years ago. And in the case of luxury, only very recently, 5 years ago. But the challenge is that all these brands, when they came to Tmall, for example, they met an incredible success because they arrived at a time when Tmall had more customers every day. And so the story of almost every brand is you come to China, you come on Tmall, you open a store, you get a market share, which is a small, pie a small share of the pie. For a year or two, you grow your market share to get to, what's your fair size. And after that, you start losing market share every day because Tmall brings in new brands.
Renee Hartman explained to us on episode 17 that Tmall belongs to Alibaba and works as a digital mall. So it's different from a marketplace like Amazon, for example. Within Tmall, you have multiple shops that are owned by different brands. So you go to the brand's page and you can find details about their products, watch brand's content, and more. To Jacques' point, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, as Tmall was growing and more consumers were joining the platform, and even when brands were losing market shares, more brands were getting added, revenue was still growing because the pie was getting bigger.
Let's remember that most global brands who came to China met incredible success, and therefore, a big portion, a growing portion of the global revenue came from China, and a growing portion of the profitability of the global organizations, came from China. So everybody looked at China and the Chinese team as high-performing business units, right? An incredibly growingly critical part of the organization. In 2020 and 2021, the economy was still growing. The consumer confidence was high, and so at a time when people were very nervous about what was happening in the rest of the world, in China it was to a large extent business as usual. I think as a result of this, exceptional level of performance and contribution that came from China before and during COVID, global brands have never really made a strong investment in trying to understand the black box that is the Chinese digital ecosystem. It's in Chinese, it's completely different, and it was working very well. So if it's working very well, you don't need to fix something that's not broken.
There's an expression where it came from that says you don't touch a team that is winning. And that's what pretty much how brands embraced the growing revenue in China until it wasn't growing as fast as before. And we'll get into it later. But the bigger concerns that made me reach out to Jacques when I was in Shanghai were really the many alarming articles discussing terms as luxury downturns, luxury fatigue, luxury shaming, and especially luxury slowdown. But Jacques has a very specific point of view for it.
I think the performance of brands in China today is a very misleading KPI to assess the health of the Chinese luxury market. And what I mean by that is that we have to remember that until 2019, meaning pre-COVID, Chinese consumers were spending 2/3, not a small portion, 2/3 of their luxury expenditure outside China. And so, when COVID happened, the only big difference for the Chinese market was that people who were in China like me could not travel outside China. And so what that means is that, you're talking about consumers who used to spend 2/3 of their expenditures outside China, and overnight they can't travel. So of course they're going to spend more in China. And that's why the Chinese luxury market grew by 40% in 2020 and by another 40% in 2021, and therefore went from slightly more than 30 billion euros in 2019 to 60 billion in 2021. So everybody was singing the praises of the explosive growth of the Chinese luxury market. But in reality, that 60 billion needs to be compared not to the 30 billion of 2019, but to the 92 billion that were being spent by Chinese consumers in 2019. And so it's very ironic, because we started talking about the growth of the Chinese luxury market. Chinese consumers reduced their luxury expenditure by 1/3, from 90 billion to 60 billion, right? And then to make things even more confusing, when do we start talking about a slowdown? Last year. Last year, because the market grew by about 12% in 2023 in China. But again, I think it's very misleading to look at that KPI, because the fact that the market went from 52 to 58 billion from 22 to 23 is interesting. But what's more interesting is that all of a sudden you had 30% of luxury expenditure taking place outside China, which means that the total number wasn't 58 billion, but actually 83 billion. And when you compare that to 2022, that means that the Chinese consumers spent 52% more last year than the year before. 52% on luxury goods. And so when did we start talking about explosive growth? When luxury brands lost 1/3 of their Chinese consumers. When did we start talking about a slowdown? When luxury expenditure by Chinese consumers grew by 52%. And so that's why I think you have to be careful.
Basically, despite the fact that China's economy has slowed down and is expecting a bit over 4% growth, observing only luxury sales in the country is a poor KPI, because the boom of sales growth in the mainland happened mostly when borders were closed, and the Chinese had to buy products locally. Now the borders are back open, there's a significant loss in currency power, and when comparing yen to euros, consumers are shopping in other countries. Japan, for example, has seen a remarkable surge in tourist spending in 2024, driven in no small part by Chinese shoppers. LVMH sales in the region that includes China slumped 14% and in Q2, but soared 57% in Japan, showing there is demand for the products and not really a luxury fatigue, but more of a notable cost from a margin perspective.
You have to differentiate between, I think, 3 different categories. You've got the middle class, the upper middle class, and the high net worth individuals. Upper middle class and high net worth individuals, to a large extent, haven't changed their approach and consumption when it comes to luxury. In the middle class consumers, when it comes to middle class consumers, they are under the pressure of the Chinese economy today. Whether it's their concerns regarding the job market or their concerns regarding the real estate market, they're seeing pressure on their wealth, they're seeing pressure on their income, and as a result, they're cutting down. Okay, But at the end of the day, the true luxury brands are not dependent on the middle class. They're far more focused on the upper middle class and high net worth individuals. So I think there's a big narrative, on this luxury slowdown, and I just don't subscribe to it, at least when it comes to the Chinese consumer.
And there's another phenomenon that has arisen, taking advantage of currency fluctuations, and that gave the opportunity to the gray market growth in China. There's an app called Daewoo that accounted for 73% of the country's gray market revenue, where you can buy luxury items from Japan at a much lower cost. According to Bloomberg, on China's social media, there's no shortage of tutorials on how to resell luxury items on Daewoo. In one example, a video outlines the full process of purchasing a Gucci belt abroad for $341, shipping it to China through Hong Kong, and then listing it on Daewoo for $460. A price is still 20% below the official domestic retail price. Another proof that there isn't a lack of desirability. But there is something else that we need to pay attention to, and that is discounts. While I was in Jacques' office in Shanghai, he showed me some live streaming sessions promoting beauty products with super heavy discounts.
When you look at the prestige beauty market, you're seeing that brands today have, to a large extent, adopted commercial strategy that I don't believe to be sustainable. Because you're talking about, brands that are offering discounts, that are participating in Tmall and JD and Douyin promotions. It's hard to imagine that, that it is a sustainable strategy for brands like La Mer, for Lancôme, or for Christian Dior. And it's especially true when you're talking about a brand like Christian Dior that has, first and foremost is a fashion, and leather goods luxury business, and that also happens to have a beauty business. And so you don't want the beauty business's commercial strategy to bring the brand down. And when you look at the way prestige beauty brands are running live streams in China, you're seeing brands that are basically focusing almost entirely on the discount, the promotion, the gift with purchase, and that's the opposite of what luxury is. And so I don't think this is a sustainable strategy for any prestige brand, but it's even more something that needs to be avoided and given up as fast as possible by brands that are part of a even bigger luxury business.
It does feel like it isn't a luxury brand if you can buy 5 items for the price of one, especially when it is presented the way they did in the video with different shades of lipsticks on the influencers' arms. If Tmall and other digital platforms are a very important part of the consumer journey, especially when it comes to discovery and understanding of the brand, and this is the first thing they see, how will they feel about it when purchasing a bag from Dior? These promotions and discounts mentioned by Jacques hurt the brand equity as a whole and give opportunities to other brands to arise.
Chanel was one of the largest brands on Tmall for the last several years, right? They haven't done any discount, any promotion, any live streams, okay? And I believe that one of the reasons why they're being extremely consistent in terms of their value presentation and their focus on brand story and product benefits is because they understand that it's not about selling beauty products. You're not a consumer packaged goods company. You're a luxury brand. And therefore, everything you do, with the right hand has an impact on the left hand. And so you have to be very careful.
Like Chanel, Hermès has been extremely consistent with their brand exclusivity, heritage, storytelling, and the public they want for the brand. That is one of the reasons why the brand has double-digit growth in Q2. While some brands bet into the middle class that now are shopping less and are under economic pressure, Hermès rely on the high-end consumers and has a Tmall presence since 2021 without having to drop prices and use discounts.
Having a presence on Tmall or on JD is a lot more than an e-shop in order to generate revenue. Because whether you're talking about luxury, which usually is, over 95% of the revenue takes place offline, or whether you're talking about beauty, where it's still at least 60, sometimes 75% of the revenue that's taking place offline. The role of Tmall and JD, of these e-commerce marketplaces, yes, of course, to generate revenue, but it's also to inform the consumer journey of the offline customer. And we know that about 80% of offline consumers go online on Tmall in order to learn about the brand. And so, when you look at your Tmall presence, you have to think about it, not just in terms of, transaction and revenue KPIs and conversion. You also have to look at it in terms of, am I giving the right brand impression? Am I, presenting the brand from a brand universe standpoint, from a storytelling standpoint, the right way? And some brands are doing it very well. Others are, forgetting that revenue shouldn't be the driving KPIs.
So going back to the beginning of this episode, where we were talking about how different and new this Chinese ecosystem is, brands need to start understanding more about it. While in the last few years, when the pie was growing and so the revenue, the headquarters didn't pay too much attention to how it works. Now is the time to really be heads down on understanding all the nuances of the Chinese consumer journey that is so big digitally, and that very often the transaction doesn't even happen in the country.
I think the leading brands understand very well that the, slowdown or no slowdown, the Chinese market still represents a important percentage of their total business. And so, at the end of the day, sometimes we hear about the explosive growth of India over the next 5 years and so on. Best case scenario, by 2030, India will still be far smaller than China, okay, from a luxury market standpoint. So brands understand that in order to win globally, they need to win in China.
As we understood in this episode, there isn't a lower desirability for luxury products from the Chinese consumer side. Consumers still want the luxury products, and they are buying them outside of China or in the gray market. And when it comes to beauty, even on live streams that are offering 55% discounts. There is a margin and therefore a revenue challenge here when navigating different currencies, variability, and the gray market is taking advantage of this price arbitrage. And so the shoppers that would prefer spending the holidays somewhere and getting a better deal for a luxury bag, they're doing it. The focus shouldn't be, though, the sales in China, but mostly the Chinese consumers, since the borders open and sales are happening elsewhere, and brands should understand the country's digital ecosystem to continue to engage these consumers where they are. Let's remember that there is an economic slowdown in China, and that is impacting the middle class affordability of these premium products. But is the middle class the target for luxury brands? I hope you enjoyed this episode, my first from my trip to China. I think it's important for us to understand the layers of the markets before starting to say that people don't want luxury products anymore. Make sure you register for the live event of RFID and supply chain visibility that I will participate in together with NIDA. Links in the show notes. See you next Tuesday.